The impact rattled my skull, sending a shockwave of pain through my entire body that radiated down my spine and into my limbs, and my eulogy note cards scattered across the polished church floor like fallen leaves, the cream-colored paper stark against the dark wood. The words I had spent 3 sleepless nights writing, revising, crying over, disappeared beneath the pews, under shoes, irretrievable and suddenly meaningless. Before I could even begin to process what was happening, before my mind could catch up with the violence of the moment, before I could draw a full breath into my lungs, his father was on top of me throwing punches while people screamed around us, their voices high-pitched and panicked. The sanctuary erupted into chaos, voices overlapping in a cacophony of shock and horror that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "You don't get to speak about Henry!" he roared, his face twisted with a grief so profound it had transformed into rage, into something primal and terrifying. Spittle flew from his mouth as he screamed, landing on my face. "You killed my son!" The words were like physical blows, each syllable a condemnation. 2 ushers dragged him off of me, their faces pale with the surreality of the situation, their hands shaking as they struggled to restrain a man unhinged by loss, while his wife stood in the aisle pointing at me with a shaking finger, her whole body trembling. Her whole arm trembled as if she were being electrocuted, as if touching live wires. The diamonds on her rings caught the light filtering through the stained glass windows, creating tiny rainbows that seemed obscene in this moment of pure hatred. "Murderer," she whispered, but in the terrible silence that had fallen over the church, in the breathless pause that followed the violence, that whisper carried like a shout, like a proclamation that everyone heard and absorbed. Henry's brother stepped forward from where he'd been sitting in the front row, his movements deliberate and controlled, his voice like ice, controlled in a way that was somehow more terrifying than his father's violence, more calculated and therefore more dangerous. "We know you gave him the pills. We know you were there the night he died and did nothing." His eyes were Henry's eyes, the same green I'd known since we were 5 years old, since we'd met on the first day of kindergarten and bonded over our matching superhero lunchboxes, but filled with an accusation so complete it felt like a physical blow, like hands wrapped around my throat. The funeral director, a thin man in an immaculate black suit who had probably never dealt with something like this in his entire career, who was trained to handle grief but not violence, appeared at my elbow with the silent efficiency of someone who had materialized from thin air. His face was professionally neutral, but his voice shook slightly as he suggested I leave before they called the police, before this escalated further, before someone decided to finish what Henry's father had started. It wasn't really a suggestion, though he phrased it as one. I looked around at faces I had known my entire life. Faces from birthday parties and graduations and summer barbecues, faces that had smiled at me countless times, and they all stared at me like I was diseased, like I was something contaminated that needed to be removed from their presence before I infected them too. Mrs. Colt, who had taught both Henry and me in 3rd grade, who had praised my reading skills and encouraged my love of books, looked away when my eyes met hers, her mouth pressed into a thin line of disgust. Coach Williams, who had coached us in Little League and celebrated when we won the championship in 8th grade, shook his head slowly with disgust, written plainly across his weathered face, with disappointment that cut deeper than anger. My own parents sat 3 rows back, my mother's face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with what could have been sobs, or could have been something else entirely. My father wouldn't meet my eyes, wouldn't even try. He stared straight ahead at the altar, at Henry's casket covered in white roses that filled the air with their sickly sweet perfume. His jaw clenched so tight, I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin, could see the tension radiating through his entire body. I left without a word, stumbling down the aisle on legs that barely held me, past the flowers and the grief and the hate that hung in the air like smoke. The heavy church doors closed behind me with a finality that felt like the end of everything, like a chapter closing, like being expelled from the only world I'd ever known. By morning, someone had spray-painted "disgusting" across my car in bright red letters that dripped down the windshield like blood, like something out of a horror movie. The paint was still wet enough to smear when I touched it, staining my fingers crimson, marking me. I stood in my parents' driveway staring at it as the sun rose, unable to form coherent thoughts beyond the simple observation that this was my life now, that this was what I had become in the eyes of everyone who mattered. The coffee shop where I had worked for 2 years, where I knew everyone's usual order and they knew mine, where I'd felt like part of a small community, fired me before I could even walk through the door, before I could explain or defend myself. The manager, Sarah, who I'd considered a friend, who I'd covered shifts for when she was sick, met me outside on the sidewalk with her arms crossed defensively. She couldn't look at me either as she told me not to bother coming in, that they couldn't have someone like me around the customers, that it was bad for business. Her voice cracked when she said it, revealing some small measure of conflict or regret. But she said it anyway, choosing the safety of the crowd over whatever friendship we'd had. My girlfriend left my things on her porch in 3 hastily packed cardboard boxes, with a note saying never contact her again written in handwriting that was usually so neat and careful. The handwriting was shaky, the letters uneven, showing her emotional state. I'd loved her with a certainty I'd never felt about anything else. I thought she'd loved me with the same intensity. We'd talked about moving in together, about getting a dog, about building a future that now lay shattered at my feet. Inside the boxes, I found photos we'd taken together, all of them torn precisely in half, my face removed from every happy memory. When I tried to explain I had never given Henry pills, that I wasn't even there when he died, that I didn't know what they were talking about, that this was all some terrible mistake, people looked at me with such contempt I stopped trying, stopped defending myself. The truth didn't matter, I realized with a sinking despair. The truth was irrelevant in the face of their certainty, their need for someone to blame, their desire for a simple answer to an incomprehensible tragedy. Then my parents sat me down at the kitchen table where I'd eaten breakfast every morning of my childhood, where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays, and told me very calmly, in voices stripped of all emotion, as if they were discussing the weather, that I should move away until things settled down, until people forgot or found someone else to hate. My mother's hands shook while pouring coffee, the cup rattling against the saucer in a rhythm that matched my racing heartbeat. She'd made it the way I liked it, with cream and 2 sugars, a habit so ingrained she did it automatically even now, even in this moment when everything else had fallen apart. My father couldn't look at me, staring instead at a spot on the wall just over my left shoulder, as if I were already a ghost. They never asked if I did it. Not once. That silence was louder than any accusation, more damning than any words they could have spoken. I packed my car that same night, throwing clothes and books and whatever else I could grab into duffel bags and boxes without care or organization. I didn't organize anything. I didn't plan where I was going or what I would do. I just needed to move, to do something, to escape the suffocating weight of an entire town's judgment pressing down on me. I drove until I hit a city where nobody knew my name, where I could walk down the street without seeing hate in every pair of eyes that landed on me, where I could be anonymous and invisible. I got a warehouse job where nobody asked questions, where my past was irrelevant, where the work was physical enough to exhaust me into something resembling sleep each night, though nightmares still found me. My coworkers were other people running from other things, and we had an unspoken agreement not to pry into each other's pasts, to accept each other at face value without digging deeper. We moved boxes and loaded trucks and went home, and that was enough, or at least it had to be. Slowly, painfully, like a bone knitting back together, I rebuilt something resembling a life, though it felt like a pale imitation of what I'd had before. I made friends, but kept everyone at a distance, never letting anyone get close enough to ask the real questions, to peek behind the curtain of my carefully constructed normalcy. Because how do you explain that your best friend died and everyone thinks you killed him? How do you explain that your own parents looked at you with doubt in their eyes? How do you tell someone that the person you loved most in the world is gone, and you've been blamed for his absence? 5 years crawled by with the speed of erosion, of glaciers carving through stone, each day blending into the next in a monotonous stream of wake, work, sleep, repeat, an endless cycle that kept me moving forward without really living. The sharp pain of those first months dulled into something manageable, something I could carry without collapsing under its weight. But there was always this absence where Henry used to exist, and where my family used to exist, and where my entire history used to be, a hole in the shape of everything I'd lost. Sometimes I would reach for my phone to text him about something funny, before remembering that he was gone, that his number would ring into a void. The grief would hit me fresh all over again each time, a surprise attack that left me breathless. Last month I was moving apartments, downsizing to something cheaper, something more suited to my solitary existence, and packing my bookshelf when a poetry collection fell to the floor with a heavy thud. The thud startled me out of the autopilot rhythm I'd fallen into, breaking through the numbness. Henry had given it to me for my birthday the year before he died, wrapped in newspaper comics because he could never be bothered to buy proper wrapping paper, because he thought the funny pages were more personal anyway. I had thanked him and shelved it and never opened it once, because I'd never been much for poetry and he'd known that, had given it to me anyway with that half smile that meant he was challenging me to try something new, to expand my horizons. An envelope fell out when it hit the ground, fluttering like a wounded bird, dancing through the air before settling on the bare floor. My name was written on it in Henry's handwriting, the familiar loops and slants I'd seen on 1,000 notes passed in class, on birthday cards, on grocery lists for camping trips we'd taken in high school. My hands went numb, all sensation draining from my fingers. The letter was dated 3 days before he died, before everything ended. "If you're reading this, something happened to me and you need to know the truth," it started, and my world tilted on its axis. My hands shook holding the pages, making the words blur and dance before my eyes. I had to sit down on the bare floor, my legs giving out beneath me like they'd been cut. Henry explained he had been volunteering at a care facility where he met a man named Joseph who had been paralyzed 20 years earlier in a hit and run that had destroyed his life. He described the whole night while I was helping with his physical therapy, Henry wrote in that careful, deliberate way he had. A car jumped the curb and hit him. Multiple people got out and looked at him lying there. Then they got back in and drove away while he was screaming for help. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, spreading outward like frost across a window, like ice in my veins. The letter continued, and I read about how the details matched a specific night from our childhood, a night I had nearly forgotten, a night buried under years of other memories, a night when both sets of parents went out together and came home acting strange and nervous, and told us never to talk about that evening again, never to mention it. We'd been 10 years old, confused by their agitation but obedient, trusting in a way that children trust their parents implicitly. I confronted them, Henry wrote, and I could imagine the scene, could see his face as he demanded answers. All 4 of them together, they admitted everything. My father had been driving and swerved onto the sidewalk, had lost control or made a choice that changed everything. They all panicked seeing Joseph broken on the ground, his legs bent at angles that legs shouldn't bend, his body shattered. Henry's parents convinced everyone to leave before police arrived because it would destroy their careers and families, because admitting what they'd done seemed worse than the act itself. They had kept that secret for 20 years while Joseph lived in a wheelchair without justice or compensation or even an apology, while an innocent man suffered for their cowardice. I told them they had to come forward and make this right, the letter said, Henry's idealism shining through even in written words. They begged me not to tell you. They said you didn't need to carry this. I agreed to stay quiet while I figured out what to do, because I didn't want to destroy you with this. Then the tone shifted, and my blood went ice cold, fear replacing the shock. Strange things have been happening since I confronted them. My brakes failed on the highway, but the mechanic found nothing wrong. Someone followed me home twice. I keep getting calls in the middle of the night with just breathing on the other end. I don't know if I'm paranoid or if they're trying to scare me quiet, but I'm scared enough to hide this letter somewhere. You'll only find it if something happens to me. The final paragraph destroyed me, shattered what was left of my understanding of the world. If something happens and it looks like an accident or an overdose, you should know I've never touched that stuff in my life. Don't believe whatever they tell you. My parents have access to prescription medications through their work, and I wouldn't put it past them if they felt trapped. I hope you never have to read this, but if you do, you need to decide what to do with the truth. I won't be around to fight this battle. Update. I read Henry's letter 3 more times sitting on my apartment floor, my hands shaking so badly the pages rustled like leaves in a storm. Every word confirmed what I'd suspected deep down for 5 years, but was too broken to pursue. Henry didn't overdose. My parents and his parents murdered him to protect their secret. I'd been living in exile for a crime I didn't commit while the real killers walked free. The letter trembled in my grip as I traced Henry's handwriting with my finger, memorizing every loop and curve like I could somehow bring him back by studying the way he formed his letters. My chest felt tight, compressed, like someone had wrapped steel bands around my ribs and was slowly tightening them. The bare apartment walls seemed to close in around me as the truth settled into my bones with a weight that made it hard to breathe. The first thing I did was photograph every page of Henry's letter with my phone, making sure each shot was clear and readable. I emailed the photos to 3 different accounts, including one I'd just created specifically for this purpose. Then I uploaded them to cloud storage, creating backups of the backups. I learned from Henry's mistake. If something happened to me, this evidence needed to survive, and I wasn't leaving anything to chance this time. My fingers moved fast across the phone screen, driven by a fear that someone might burst through my door at any moment to stop me. Each successful upload felt like a small victory, a piece of insurance against the people who had already proven they would kill to keep their secret buried. I called in sick to my warehouse job for the first time in 5 years. My supervisor answered on the 3rd ring, sounding annoyed at the early morning call. I told him I had food poisoning, forcing my voice to sound weak and strained, which wasn't hard given how my stomach was actually churning. He grumbled something about finding coverage for my shift and hung up without asking questions. I spent the entire day researching Joseph's hit-and-run case online, hunched over my laptop at my kitchen table with cold coffee growing a film beside me. The local newspaper archives from 20 years ago described a 30-year-old man left paralyzed on a sidewalk with no witnesses, no suspects, and a case that went cold within months. The articles painted Joseph as a random victim of a careless driver who panicked and fled, never imagining that 4 people had deliberately chosen to leave him broken and bleeding. I found the care facility where Joseph lived through the article mentions and social services records that were surprisingly easy to locate with basic internet searches. My heart pounded as I realized I was about to meet the man whose suffering my father caused, whose life was destroyed so my parents could protect their careers and reputations. I wrote down the address on a scrap of paper, my handwriting shaky and uneven. The facility was called Meadowbrook Care Center, a name that sounded peaceful and calm, completely at odds with the violence that had put Joseph there. I stared at the address until the numbers blurred, imagining what I would say to him, how I would explain why I was there without revealing everything right away. The next morning, I drove 3 hours to Joseph's care facility, a clean but institutional building that smelled like disinfectant and boiled vegetables. The scent hit me as soon as I walked through the automatic doors, making my stomach turn. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh white glow that made the beige walls look even more depressing. I approached the front desk, where a tired-looking woman in scrubs sat typing on a computer. I told her I was Joseph's nephew visiting from out of town, the lie coming easier than I expected. She barely glanced up from her screen, just pointed down a hallway and told me room 117. No ID check, no visitor log, no questions about why a nephew they'd apparently never heard of was suddenly showing up. The lack of security made me angry on Joseph's behalf, though it worked in my favor. Joseph was 50 now, gray-haired and thin in his wheelchair, watching a cooking show on a small TV mounted to the wall. The room was sparse, containing just a bed, the wheelchair, a small dresser, and that TV. A single window looked out onto a parking lot. When I knocked on the open door, he turned toward me with eyes that were sharp and alert despite his age. I introduced myself using a fake name, calling myself David Matthews, and said I was researching his case for a true crime podcast. His eyes lit up with an eagerness that broke my heart. This man had been waiting 20 years for someone to care about what happened to him. He gestured for me to sit in the only chair in the room, a plastic thing that looked like it came from a school cafeteria. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the TV remote to turn down the volume. He described the night of the accident in detail that matched Henry's letter perfectly. The car jumped the curb, he said, his voice steady despite the pain the memory clearly caused. Multiple people got out and looked at him lying there with his legs shattered and bent wrong. Then they got back in and drove away while he screamed for help, his voice echoing off the empty street with no one around to hear except the people who had hit him. Joseph told me he'd spent 2 decades wondering why no one ever came forward, why the people who looked him in the eyes chose to leave him bleeding on the sidewalk. His voice cracked when he described calling out to them, begging them to stay, to call for help, to do anything except abandon him. They had stared at him for what felt like forever, he said, before making the choice to protect themselves instead of saving him. I asked Joseph if he ever suspected who hit him, trying to keep my voice casual and professional like a real podcaster would. He reached beside his wheelchair and pulled out a worn folder containing newspaper clippings, his own handwritten notes, and a list of luxury cars registered in the area at the time. The folder was thick, stuffed with papers that had been handled so many times the edges were soft and rounded. He'd been investigating his own case for 20 years with the limited resources available to a paralyzed man on disability, never giving up hope that someday someone would help him find answers. He spread the papers across his lap, pointing to different sections with a gnarled finger, explaining his reasoning for each lead he'd followed. His dedication was stunning and heartbreaking in equal measure. When I saw my father's name on Joseph's list of possible suspects, one of 43 luxury car owners in the area that year, my stomach dropped, and I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to throw up. The coincidence was too precise, too exact to be anything but confirmation. I realized Henry must have made the same connection when Joseph described the accident during their physical therapy sessions, must have felt this same sick recognition. I leaned over the toilet in Joseph's small bathroom, my body shaking as I heaved up the breakfast I'd barely been able to eat that morning. The bathroom smelled like industrial cleaner and old pipes. When I finally stood up and looked at myself in the mirror, my face was pale and sweaty, my eyes red-rimmed. I splashed cold water on my face and tried to pull myself together before going back out to face Joseph, knowing I couldn't tell him yet that I'd found his answer. I spent the next week at my warehouse job moving boxes on autopilot while my mind raced through possibilities and plans. My coworkers noticed I was distracted and asked if everything was okay, their voices cutting through the fog in my head. I just mumbled something about family problems and kept my head down, knowing I couldn't tell anyone what I was planning until I had solid proof. The physical work helped in a way, giving my hands something to do while my brain worked through the implications of what I'd learned. I lifted and carried and stacked, my muscles burning with exertion, while I figured out my next move. Every night I went home exhausted and fell into bed, but sleep never came easy. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, seeing Joseph's face and Henry's handwriting and my father's name on that list, all swirling together in my mind until the sun came up and I had to do it all over again. During my lunch break the next day, I sat in my car in the warehouse parking lot and pulled up old newspaper articles on my phone until I found the name Aria Combs listed as the reporter who covered Joseph's accident 20 years ago. I called the newspaper office and asked to speak with her, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The receptionist transferred me, and Aria answered on the second ring with a voice that sounded tired but alert. I told her I was researching Joseph's hit-and-run case and wanted to talk about her coverage. She went quiet for a moment, then said she remembered that case like it was yesterday, that it had bothered her for 2 decades because something felt wrong about how fast the investigation got shut down. She agreed to meet me for coffee that weekend at a diner halfway between our cities. I spent the rest of my shift moving boxes with my mind somewhere else entirely, running through what I would say to her and how much I should reveal. Saturday morning, I drove 2 hours to the diner, a place called Ruby's that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s with red vinyl booths and a black and white checkered floor. Aria was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a worn leather folder in front of her. She was maybe 50 with gray streaks in her dark hair and sharp eyes that studied me as I slid into the seat across from her. She pushed a cup of coffee toward me without asking if I wanted it, and opened the folder to reveal pages of handwritten notes and photocopied documents. She told me 3 witnesses came forward initially after Joseph's accident, all describing a dark luxury sedan that jumped the curb. But within a week, all 3 witnesses called back and said they were mistaken, that they hadn't seen anything clearly after all. The lead detective on the case, a guy named Garrett Walton, suddenly transferred to a different department before he could follow up on the car registrations, and the whole investigation just died. Aria tapped her finger on one of the documents and said she always suspected someone with influence had made the case disappear, but she was a junior reporter back then, and nobody would listen to her concerns. I pulled Henry's letter from my jacket pocket. The page is now soft from being folded and unfolded so many times. I made her promise not to publish anything until I said it was safe, and she nodded slowly, her reporter instincts clearly fighting with curiosity. She read the letter twice, her expression shifting from interest to shock to something like recognition. When she looked up at me, her eyes were different, understanding replacing the professional distance. She asked if I was the friend who got blamed at Henry's funeral, the one everyone said killed him. I nodded, and she sat back in the booth, letting out a long breath. She said she covered that funeral too, remembered the chaos and the accusations, and now she understood why I disappeared 5 years ago. Aria told me she would help me investigate quietly, that she could use her press credentials to access records I couldn't get on my own. 3 days later, she called me at work and said she found something about Garrett Walton. He took early retirement 6 months after transferring off Joseph's case and bought a house in Florida that cost 3 times his annual salary. I felt something click into place in my head, another piece of the puzzle fitting together. I bought a burner phone from a convenience store that night and spent an hour researching true crime podcasts so I could sound convincing. The next morning, I called Garrett's number, which Aria had pulled from public records, and told him I was researching cold cases for a podcast. He was retired and bored and surprisingly eager to talk, especially when I mentioned Joseph's name and the dark luxury sedan that was never found. Garrett started talking and didn't stop for 40 minutes. He told me off the record that his captain pressured him to drop the investigation, that the captain got pressure from someone higher up in local government. He never found out who exactly made the case disappear. But 3 weeks after he transferred departments, he found an envelope in his mailbox with $50,000 in cash and a note that said, "Retirement fund. Forget the wheelchair guy." His voice got quiet when he told me that part, like he was ashamed but also defensive about his choice. I thanked him and hung up, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. I sat in my car outside the convenience store and realized I was in over my head, that I needed professional help to build a case strong enough to reopen a 20-year-old investigation and prove Henry was murdered. I called Aria and asked if she knew any private investigators who specialized in cold cases. She gave me Declan Frost's number and said he was expensive but good, that he'd worked on wrongful death investigations before. I used most of my savings to hire Declan, meeting him in his office downtown where he sat behind a desk covered in file folders and case notes. He was maybe 40 with gray eyes and a way of listening that made you feel like every word mattered. I showed him Henry's letter and watched him read it carefully, his expression neutral but focused. When he finished, he looked at me and said the conspiracy angle interested him, that he would take my case for a reduced rate because something about it felt important. Declan brought in his wife Siobhan a week later, a woman with red hair and quick fingers who worked as a forensic accountant. She traced financial connections between my parents, Henry's parents, Garrett Walton, and the police captain who shut down the investigation. Within a week, she found a pattern of cash withdrawals from a joint account my parents and Henry's parents opened 20 years ago. The account showed over $200,000 withdrawn in cash over the years, all untraceable payments that lined up with key moments in the cover-up. I stared at the spreadsheet she showed me with dates and amounts, seeing the proof of their guilt laid out in numbers and transactions. The evidence was building into something real, something that couldn't be ignored or explained away. I drove back to my hometown for the first time in 5 years on a Tuesday evening, my stomach tight with nerves and anger. I parked 3 blocks from my parents' house and pulled out the binoculars I'd bought at a sporting goods store. Through their kitchen window, I could see them moving around, making dinner together like they did every night when I was growing up. My mother looked older with more gray in her hair and a slight limp when she walked. My father stood at the stove stirring something in a pot. They were laughing about something, their faces relaxed and content, like they didn't have a care in the world. I sat there shaking with rage so intense it made my vision blur, watching these people who raised me go about their normal evening while Joseph sat in a wheelchair and Henry was dead, and I'd spent 5 years in exile for their crimes. The next morning, I followed my father to his medical practice, staying 3 cars back as he drove through familiar streets. I parked across from his office and watched patients come and go all morning. Normal people bringing their kids for checkups, elderly folks with canes, pregnant women holding their bellies. They all trusted him with their health, smiled at him when he held the door. Had no idea the man treating them was a murderer who let an innocent man take the blame for destroying Joseph's life. The disconnect between his respectable doctor persona and the truth made me physically sick. I had to get out of my car and lean against it, breathing hard, fighting the urge to run across the street and tell everyone what he really was. I drove back to my apartment with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white and my fingers ached. My phone rang while I was stopped at a red light, and Declan's name showed on the screen. I answered, and he started talking fast, his voice excited in a way I hadn't heard before. He found Henry's original autopsy report buried in archived files at the medical examiner's office, and the toxicology screen showed sedative levels that didn't match recreational use at all. The amounts were consistent with forced ingestion, with someone who knew exactly what they were doing, administering specific doses designed to stop breathing without leaving obvious signs. The medical examiner had noted unusual bruising on Henry's upper arms in a pattern consistent with restraint, with someone holding him down. But the police department pressured the examiner to rule it an accidental overdose anyway. Declan said the bruising pattern matched what you'd see if two people grabbed someone's arms and held them, while a third person forced pills down their throat. I pulled over into a parking lot because my hands were shaking too badly to drive, and I had to put the phone on speaker because I couldn't hold it steady. Declan kept talking, explaining how the specific combination of sedatives required access to prescription medications from multiple controlled categories, the kind of access my mother had through her work at the pharmacy and Henry's father had through his medical practice. The evidence was building into something concrete, something that couldn't be explained away or dismissed. I thanked Declan and sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to process what this meant, that I finally had proof Henry was murdered, that the truth was coming together piece by piece. The next morning, I called the hospital where Henry died and asked for the administrator's office. A woman transferred me, and a man answered saying his name was Leif Pettersson. I used my real name for the first time in 5 years when dealing with anything related to Henry's death and demanded access to all records related to his case under Freedom of Information laws. Leif's voice went cold and professional, and he started listing reasons why he couldn't release those records, privacy regulations and hospital policy, and legal restrictions. I interrupted him and said I was Henry's best friend who got falsely accused of killing him at his funeral, who spent 5 years in exile while the real murderers walked free, and I needed those records to prove what actually happened. The silence on the other end of the line stretched out for maybe 10 seconds, and then Leif's whole tone changed completely. He said he always thought something was wrong about how quickly that case got closed, how the police showed up and took statements, and then everything just stopped with no follow-up or investigation. He told me to come to his office the next day, and he would see what he could do. I drove 3 hours back to my hometown the following afternoon and met Leif in his office on the 4th floor of the hospital. He was maybe 50 with gray hair and tired eyes that looked like they'd seen too many bad things. He closed his office door and pulled a USB drive from his desk drawer and handed it to me. He explained that his IT department had archived the security footage from the night Henry died, even though they received orders to delete it, that the IT director thought the deletion request was suspicious and kept a backup copy just in case. I plugged the USB drive into my laptop right there in his office, and we watched the footage together. The timestamp showed my mother and Henry's father entering Henry's apartment building at 8:15 in the evening, 2 hours before Henry's body was found. They were carrying a medical bag between them, the kind doctors use for house calls. The footage showed them leaving at 9:45 without the bag, walking quickly to their car with their heads down. I watched it 3 times, my stomach turning over each time I saw my mother's face on that screen, saw her walking into that building knowing what she was about to do. Leif made me a copy of the footage and told me his wife Melody worked as a toxicology expert at a private lab across town. He called her while I sat there and explained the situation, and she agreed to meet with me that same afternoon. I drove to the lab and found Melody in a small office filled with file folders and reference books. She was younger than Leif, maybe 40, with red hair pulled back in a tight bun. I showed her the autopsy report Declan had found, and she spent an hour going through the toxicology results with a pen and notepad, making calculations and checking reference materials. She confirmed the sedative levels indicated someone with medical knowledge had administered the drugs, that the specific combination used would require access to prescription medications from at least 3 different controlled substance categories. She explained how the dosages were carefully calculated to cause respiratory failure that would look like an accidental overdose to anyone not examining the results closely. The precision of it made her certain this wasn't recreational drug use or even a suicide, but a planned killing carried out by people who understood pharmacology and had access to restricted medications. I thanked her and drove back to my apartment with the USB drive and her written analysis, feeling like I was carrying evidence of my own parents' guilt in my pocket. Over the next week, I worked with Declan to compile everything into one comprehensive file. We organized Henry's letter, Joseph's testimony about the hit and run, Arya's original investigation notes from 20 years ago, Garrett's confession about being paid off to drop the case, the financial records Siobhan had traced showing the cash payments, the hospital security footage, and Melody's toxicology analysis. Each piece of evidence by itself was circumstantial, could maybe be explained away, but when viewed together as a pattern, they told a clear story of conspiracy and murder. Declan printed everything and put it in a thick folder with tabs separating each section, making it easy to follow the timeline from the original hit and run through Henry's death and the cover-up. I held that folder in my hands and realized I was holding the truth that could destroy my parents and Henry's parents, could send them all to prison, could finally clear my name after 5 years of exile. The weight of it felt both crushing and liberating at the same time. I drove to the police station in my hometown on a Tuesday morning when I knew it wouldn't be too busy. I walked up to the front desk and asked to speak with the detective currently assigned to cold cases. The officer at the desk made a phone call and told me to wait in the lobby. 20 minutes later, a woman in her 40s came down the hallway wearing slacks and a blazer with a detective's badge clipped to her belt. She introduced herself as Detective Morrison and asked what this was about. When I told her my name, I saw recognition flash across her face immediately. She knew who I was, remembered Henry's file, remembered the accusations at the funeral. Her expression went cold and suspicious, and she crossed her arms over her chest. I placed the evidence folder on the counter between us and said she needed to read everything before making any judgments about me, that the truth was in those pages and I'd spent 5 years gathering proof while everyone thought I was a murderer. She picked up the folder and flipped through the first few pages, and her expression shifted from suspicion to interest. She told me to follow her to an interview room, and I sat in a hard plastic chair while she took the folder with her. The interview room was small with gray walls and a metal table, and that distinctive smell of cleaning products and stale coffee. I sat there for 3 hours drinking terrible coffee from a machine down the hall and trying not to panic. My leg bounced up and down, and I kept checking my phone even though I had no one to call, no one who would care where I was or what I was doing. When Morrison finally came back, her expression was grim, but determined. She sat down across from me and said what I'd brought her was enough to reopen both Joseph's hit and run case and Henry's death investigation as a potential homicide. She explained the process would take time, that they'd need to verify everything and conduct new interviews and build a prosecutable case, but the evidence I'd compiled gave them a solid foundation to start. She asked if I was prepared for what would happen when this became public, when people found out the truth, when my parents and Henry's parents got arrested. I told her I'd been prepared for 5 years, that I'd lost everything already, and had nothing left to lose. The next week moved in a blur of official statements and evidence submissions and legal procedures. Morrison brought in other detectives, and they interviewed me for hours about everything I knew, about that night 20 years ago, when we were kids and our parents came home acting strange, about the days leading up to Henry's death, about the funeral and the accusations and my 5 years in exile. The prosecutor's office got involved, and I had to give multiple depositions describing the same events over and over while lawyers asked detailed questions and took notes. I missed work at the warehouse and my supervisor called asking what was going on, and I just told him family emergency, and he didn't push for details. I barely slept that week, lying awake at night wondering when the arrests would happen, when my parents would find out I was the one who brought everything to the police, when the truth would finally come out. I was sitting in my apartment on a Friday evening eating takeout Chinese food straight from the container when my phone rang with Aria's number. I answered and she said the police had arrested all 4 parents that afternoon. My mother and father, Henry's mother and father, all taken into custody on charges ranging from vehicular assault and leaving the scene of an accident to obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit murder. The news broke locally within hours, and my phone started ringing with numbers I didn't recognize, reporters trying to get my story, wanting quotes about being falsely accused and spending 5 years in exile. I turned my phone off and sat in the dark apartment watching the lights of the city through my window, feeling something I hadn't felt in 5 years that might have been relief, or might have been the beginning of grief I'd been holding back. The next morning, Henry's brother called, and I almost didn't answer when I saw his name on my screen. His voice shook when he spoke, and he apologized for attacking me at the funeral, for believing his parents' lies, for spending 5 years thinking I killed his brother. He said they'd been living with guilt about how they treated me, that his father had been in therapy for years dealing with the violence he committed that day in the church. He told me his whole family understood now why their parents were so desperate to blame someone else, why they needed a target for their rage and grief. They'd been protecting themselves by destroying me, and his family had been their weapon. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened while he talked, while he tried to apologize for something that couldn't be fixed with words. When he finally stopped talking, I told him I understood, that grief makes people do things they wouldn't normally do, that I didn't blame him or his siblings for believing what they were told. We talked for 20 minutes and it felt like closing a wound that had been open for 5 years, not healing it completely, but at least stopping the bleeding. 2 days later, I met Henry's brother and mother at the park where Henry and I used to play when we were kids, the same playground with the rusty swings and cracked basketball court we'd spent countless summer afternoons on. His mother looked smaller than I remembered, thinner, with gray streaks in her hair that hadn't been there 5 years ago. She started crying the moment she saw me walking across the grass toward the bench where they were waiting. She apologized over and over, the words tumbling out between sobs about how Henry's father had twisted her grief into something ugly, had convinced her I was responsible when she knew deep down something felt wrong about the whole story. She told me she'd spent 5 years hating herself for believing the lies, for pointing at me in that church, and calling me a murderer. But she hadn't known how to find me, or if I would even want to hear from her after what they did. Henry's brother sat beside her with his hands clasped between his knees, staring at the ground, and when he finally looked up at me, his eyes were red. He said their father had been in therapy for 3 years trying to deal with the violence he committed that day, the guilt eating away at him, even while he still believed I'd killed Henry. I told them I understood grief makes people do terrible things, that I didn't blame them for what happened, and Henry's mother reached out and squeezed my hand so tight it hurt. The next week, Joseph called me after Detective Morrison interviewed him as a key witness, and his voice sounded stronger than I'd ever heard it, filled with something I could only describe as relief mixed with vindication. He told me he never thought he'd see justice in his lifetime, that he'd spent 20 years in that wheelchair, wondering if anyone would ever care about what happened to him on that sidewalk. Even though 2 decades of his life were stolen, he said knowing the truth was coming out and seeing the people responsible finally facing consequences brought him a peace he hadn't felt since the night of the accident. He thanked me for not giving up, for believing Henry's letter and following through when it would have been easier to just let it all stay buried. The trial started 3 months later and took 4 months total, and I attended every single day of testimony, sitting in the back row of the courtroom watching as the prosecution presented the overwhelming evidence piece by piece. The hospital security footage played on screens showing my mother and Henry's father entering his building with that medical bag. Melody testified about the toxicology results and how the drug combinations required medical knowledge and access to prescription medications. Garrett took the stand and admitted he'd been paid off to drop the investigation into Joseph's hit and run. Siobhan walked the jury through the financial records showing $200,000 in cash withdrawals over 20 years. My father looked at me once across the courtroom during the 3rd week of testimony, his expression mixing regret and anger and shame into something I couldn't fully read, but he never tried to speak to me or offer any explanation for what they'd done. My mother kept her eyes down the entire trial, never once looking in my direction. Henry's parents sat stone-faced through most of it until the prosecution played recordings of Henry's voicemails to friends in the weeks before he died, talking about how scared he was. And then Henry's mother broke down sobbing while her husband stared straight ahead with his jaw clenched. The jury deliberated for 2 days before coming back with guilty verdicts on multiple charges for all 4 parents. The judge took another week before sentencing, and when that day came, the courtroom was packed with people from my hometown, with Joseph in his wheelchair in the front row, with Aria, and Declan and Detective Morrison all there to see it through to the end. The judge sentenced my father to 15 years for the hit and run, and conspiracy to commit murder, my mother to 10 years as an accessory after the fact, and Henry's parents each got 12 years for Henry's murder and their roles in the cover-up. As the bailiffs led them away in handcuffs, my father glanced back at me one last time, with an expression I still can't fully describe, and then they were gone through the side door that led to the holding cells. I felt something lift from my chest that I'd been carrying for 5 years, a weight so heavy I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it pressing down on me. I finally let myself cry for Henry, for Joseph, for the friendship and family I lost, and for the justice that came too late but finally arrived.